From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm Vonnie Quinn.
Evan Cirilli in Washington. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. The House Judiciary Committee holding its latest impeachment hearing today. Let's bring in Anna Edgerton, a congressional editor with Bloomberg News. All right, so what's been the latest up on Capitol Hill?
So today is the last chance for both sides, Republicans and Democrats, to kind of present their case to American people. We've been hearing from the counsels from the Intelligence Committee, and they've been putting forth the evidence that's been gathered over the past 2 months in the impeachment process thus far.
So what have we heard from the attorneys, Anna, both for obviously the Democrats and the attorneys for the Republicans?
Kind of the same thing that we've been hearing for the past few weeks. Democrats have been saying that there is such overwhelming evidence that the president, committed these acts, that he pressured a foreign power to help him in politically motivated investigations, and that the president himself also has said this publicly. Republicans, meanwhile, are saying that there is not sufficient evidence to accuse the president of these actions, and that this impeachment is a sham, that it is, not built on firsthand evidence, and they've really tried to dismiss the process as not really worth pursuing at this point.
Well, I want to pick up with what Vonnie just said, which, I was talking to sources over the weekend just who are working on the committees with regards to impeachment, and they are working on drafting articles of impeachment as we speak, and they were working all throughout the weekend. When will that process conclude and the committees introduce articles of impeachment?
Yeah, we expect to see articles of impeachment this week.
This week?
This week.
Wow.
Yeah, so they'll probably be voted first in the Judiciary Committee. That could happen as soon as Wednesday, and then going to the House floor next week. They want to wrap this up before Christmas, so right now they're on that timeline.
What are we looking at in terms of articles of impeachment, Anna? 2+?
Yeah, at least 2 articles of impeachment. The first one will be abuse of power, some kind of drafting of that, alleging that the president, abused his power in trying to elicit this help from a foreign power. The other one would be obstruction of Congress, and kind of pointing out all of the documents and witnesses that have been requested from congressional committees that the White House and the Trump administration have not turned over. So those will definitely be the 2 that we expect to see. There could be more that are added on in addition to that.
Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. There's some polls out this morning that suggest that amongst independent voters, this impeachment saga is largely just political theater noise.
That's a risk that Democrats have to take. And, Nancy Pelosi was asked about this in her press conference last week, and she said, this is not about politics. When it comes to differences on healthcare policy or, trade policy, that's about the election. That's when we can get into presenting our ideological differences to the American people. This, she said, is about the Constitution. This is about the president violating his oath of office. And, she's kind of presented it as an offense that's so grave that Congress had no choice but to act.
It's going to be fascinating to see how Speaker Pelosi plays this out. Anna Edgerton, thank you very much for giving us that update.
Let's head now overseas. UK voters heading to the polls Thursday to decide the fate of incumbent Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Recent polls show the Labour Party making small inroads, but overall it's still really a significant Tory lead. For more, let's welcome Niall Gardner, Director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Gardner, of course, a former aide to British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Niall, not to be glib, but what would Margaret Thatcher say about Boris Johnson as a Conservative Prime Minister of Britain? How would she characterise his Tory leadership?
Well, I think that Boris Johnson is in many respects a Thatcherite Prime Minister. He's a big admirer of Margaret Thatcher. It was Margaret Thatcher's wish that Britain leave the European Union, and Boris Johnson is fully committed to delivering that. And I think that Margaret Thatcher, were she still alive today, I think she would be greatly supporting Britain's drive for Brexit, which Boris Johnson is pledging to deliver. And so I think we do have a Prime Minister in place who is following many of the policies that Margaret Thatcher pursued. We have a very conservative Prime Minister who is fully committed to taking Britain outside of the European Union and advancing conservative principles and ideas.
Of course, Margaret Thatcher did enact huge changes, changed the whole structure of the economy, but there were consequences, Niall. Are we going to see the same thing if Boris Johnson gets to enact the policies that he's trying to bring to the table and exit Britain out of the European Union? Will we see recession? Will we see people out of jobs?
I think quite the opposite, actually. I think that the policies that Boris Johnson has outlined are very good policies that will deliver, I think, tremendous benefits for the United Kingdom. I think that Britain's exit from the EU will begin a new era of British prosperity. I mean, Britain can return to being a free trading nation. The United Kingdom can also control its own borders, control its own destiny, be once again, I think, a tremendous world power. And if you look at the economic situation for the UK at the moment, I think the prospects look very good. We have record levels, actually, of employment in place, some of the lowest levels of unemployment that we've seen in many, many decades. I do think that in the Brexit era, Britain is going to be a tremendous success. And we are also seeing very strong levels of foreign direct investment flowing into the United Kingdom. Those levels will increase, I think, once Brexit is delivered. So I think there's a real sense of optimism with regard to Britain's future as a truly sovereign, independent nation outside of the European Union. And I think that Boris Johnson has done a very good job in terms of outlining how Britain can move forward in the Brexit era. In contrast, I think that Jeremy Corbyn offers a far left, big government, high tax, neo-Marxist sort of outlook for Great Britain, which is the complete opposite of what Boris Johnson is offering.
In terms of what this means for US-UK trade relations, how important are these elections, especially for the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think this election is very, very important for the United States. And the US administration has been a wholehearted supporter of Brexit. It has strongly backed a US-UK free trade agreement. And if Boris Johnson secures a majority on December the 12th, as most polls indicate, then he will move forward with delivering Brexit on January the 31st. And then you will see the US and the UK, I believe, implementing a free trade agreement at some stage in 2020. And I think that a US-UK trade deal will be a force generator for economic prosperity and economic freedom on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that you'll see a large number of new US and British jobs added as a result of a trade deal. And so this is a win-win situation, I think, for both sides of the Atlantic here. If Johnson is able to move forward with Brexit on January 31st, as he has planned to do so.
All right, but if Corbyn gets in charge, very different picture, especially on the US-UK trade front, no?
Yeah, I think, Jeremy Corbyn has run a campaign that is dripping with anti-American sentiment. He is a leader of the Labour Party who I think would utterly destroy the special relationship with the United States. And I think that Jeremy Corbyn has run a relentlessly negative campaign, strongly opposed, I think, to the US-UK special relationship. Also, he's cast constant doubt over a US-UK free trade deal. He has launched a conspiracy theory about American corporations supposedly wanting to take over the National Health Service, which is completely untrue, a real example, I think, of fake news. And Jeremy Corbyn really is a far-left ideologue who advances an extremist view of the world. He's an isolationist. He is someone who would destroy, I think, not only the special relationship, but also the broader transatlantic alliance. And also he is pledging to spend, in effect, trillions of pounds on public spending projects. And the money simply isn't there. He would bankrupt the British economy.
All right, Niall, thank you for that opinion. Niall Gardner, Director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Let's get a check now on how markets are reacting to today's top stories with Abigail Doolittle, who joins us on desk.
Small moves, Bonnie. We're in wait-and-see mode because everybody, of course, wants to know what's going to happen with trade. December 15th, Sunday is coming up with that possible tariff deadline where the U.S. may lob tariffs of, I believe it's 25% on Chinese goods, especially the consumer-based goods, right ahead of the all-important holiday. So again, take a look at these tiny moves for the major averages, flipping between small gains and losses. We also have the VIX slightly higher, telling you that there's a little bit of uncertainty uncertainty there, and Haven bonds rallying as well. So overall, again, just wait and see move, waiting to see what's next with trade.
Right. Now, around the world, we're seeing a little bit of wait and see, I suppose you could say. Did get a couple of USMCA headlines earlier this morning, moved the Canadian dollar, but it really is, let's wait till the end of this week.
Yeah, it really is about trade. And even if we were to take a look at the sectors for the S&P 500, a very even mix, not small or not big moves there as well. Perhaps a little bit to the defensive side, but it's David Weston and I have been talking about this every day. It's always about trade every day. We don't have any big headlines right now, just waiting for that December 15th. And that is what it is going to be today and probably this entire week, Bonnie.
A couple of other moves there like PG&E as well. All
yes,
right.
A few big outsized movers there in individual stock names.
Abigail, thank you. That is Abigail Doolittle with our market check there. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for the Bloomberg First Word News.
Vonnie, as we've been reporting, House investigators are making their closing arguments today in the case against President Trump. At the same time, they'll keep debating how far they want to go in drafting articles of impeachment. Judiciary Committee Chairman Gerald Nadler says the president's likely to be accused of abuse of power and obstruction of justice. The Saudi gunman who killed 3 people at the Pensacola, Florida naval base on Friday had apparently gone on Twitter shortly before the shooting to criticize U.S. support of Israel and accuse America of being anti-Muslim. Officials are treating the shooting as an act of terrorism. They're also trying to determine whether the killer acted alone or was part of a larger plot. The gunman, who was in the U.S. to learn to fly, was killed by a sheriff's deputy during the rampage. The Supreme Court has left intact a controversial Kentucky law known as informed consent. It requires doctors who perform abortions to first show the woman an ultrasound and give her a detailed description of the fetus, even if she doesn't want to listen. The justices today rejected an appeal by Kentucky's only abortion clinic and its 3 doctors who said the law violates their free speech rights. France is gearing up for another week of protests. Both the government and labor unions are vowing to stick to their guns in the battle over pension reform. President Emmanuel Macron reportedly has told associates he couldn't consider running for re-election in 2020 unless his reform plans succeed. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Kevin, back to you in Washington.
Thank you, Mark. Coming up, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp defies President Trump and appoints a political newcomer to the U.S. Senate. We'll discuss the political consequences with former Georgia Congressman Jack Kingston next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York.
And I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp was ushered into office as a champion of President Trump's agenda, but now he is facing attacks from some of the president's staunchest supporters on Capitol Hill after appointing financial executive Kelly Loeffler to succeed Johnny Isakson in the Senate at the end of this year. Joining us now with more insight is former Republican Congressman from Georgia, Jack Kingston. Thank you for being here, Jack.
Kevin, it's great to be with you.
All right, so what is going on down there in Georgia?
I think if you look at we Republican men in Georgia, we kind of have the white male, the rural vote, the traditional Republican vote. But unfortunately, the last election shows we did not do very well with suburban women. Now, that wasn't unique to Georgia. So what Brian Kemp is looking at is who can bring that element to the table, and Kelly Loeffler. Yes, Kelly Loeffler has a great community background. She's been very active with Atlanta philanthropic causes. She owns a large business. She owns a national basketball team. So I think she can kind of shore up where we have become traditionally weak. So.
In terms of, as you stare down the next political year, in terms of the next 12 months in particular, you mentioned from a broader standpoint how Loeffler really could represent an opportunity for the Republican Party to win back and make inroads in suburbs all across the country. What I'm hearing from you, Jack, and you're as inside of the Republican Party as it gets. What I'm hearing is that is in private conversations something that many Republicans are aware that needs to get done.
Yes, and if you look at Karen Handel, she lost because of, I think, a lot of the traditional Republican suburban women voted the opposite way because they don't like the president. And so I think Karen Handel's going to be a great candidate, but we lost other people like State Representative Beth Baskin, a State Senator Fran Millar. Just really good, solid, I'd say center-right Republicans got wiped out in the last election, and we think adding this element back on the ticket in a major way, not just with Kelly Loeffler, but with Karen Handel and many other women. I think nationally the number's like 176 women who have filed to run for Republicans. By the way, we're up to about 160 candidates nationwide. That's 200 candidates have filed in the Republican Party, more than did this time last cycle. So we've got a robust recruitment effort going on.
But surely, Jack, the signaling, the deliberate signaling won't be lost on the Georgia voter. Will the suburban woman that you're looking for, that the Republican Party is looking for, vote, in Kelly Loeffler's favor, given that many conservative radio hosts are calling her a Republican in name only and so on?
Well, we're going to have to see, and I think that there is an element out there that are going to say, let's see how she does on the tough votes. Will she turn out to be kind of a Mitt Romney who's often against the president and often not a reliable Republican vote? So there is concern about that. But, I ran against somebody for the U.S. Senate, David Perdue, who had not ever been in public office, and he's turned out to be a great ally of the president, a great conservative, and somebody who can get things done in Washington. And I guess more importantly, as a campaigner, he never said anything wrong. And that's one thing that happens with self-funders and celebrity candidates, is sometimes they slip and say something stupid on the campaign trail because they haven't been out there before. They haven't faced people like Kevin, are you, with tough questions. And that's something that all candidates need to learn.
Jack, before I send it back to Washington, what happens next week? Presumably we get articles of impeachment this week. They'll be voted upon then in the House. Is it all over by this time next week or by the middle of next week?
I think that it is. I think it was probably all over when the Democrats won the majority in January 2017 when they were sworn in, in 18 when they were sworn in, having won back the House. I think that they've wanted to impeach the president from day one, and they've got the votes there. I will say this, I think for the 31 candidates who represent seats that President Trump won in the last cycle or in 2016, I think it's a political death sentence to them. I don't see how they survive it. I think all 31 won't get wiped out, but I think a substantial majority of them will.
Will any Democrats break with Speaker Pelosi and vote against impeachment?
Well, two have indicated two already did on the last election, and two more have indicated that they will. So I think you're going to see a bipartisan vote, but it's going to be against impeachment.
And it's not just impeachment. I mean, the volatility heading to Washington over the next couple of weeks with the funding bill, with the wall fight, with the USMCA, not to mention the U.S.-China tariffs on December 15th. Wall Street better wake up. There's a lot of volatility coming up in the next, buckle up for the next couple of weeks.
And USMCA is so close right now. I think it's going to happen, but I think the Speaker wants to get impeachment out of the way and then vote on it on the way out of town. Probably the same with the appropriation bills. They worked diligently over the weekend. I was in contact with some of my former staffers on it. So I think appropriations is going to come together. But these ladies and gentlemen in the U.S. Congress might not do any Christmas shopping until the 24th.
Yeah, they better get their online shopping done. You know who I think is going to be watching Loeffler very closely? Your Southern friend, Nikki Haley, former Governor Nikki Haley. How Loeffler navigates this new center-right world is going to be interesting to see. Jack
That's
Kingston,
a good point.
It is always great to catch up with you, my friend. He is the 2020 campaign surrogate for President Trump. And still ahead, Pacific Gas and Electric is our stock of the hour. The utility reaches a major legal settlement over California wildfires. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington.
And I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Time now for a stock of the hour. Shares of PG&E are rising the most since October, up more than 17% after the company reached a settlement with wildfire victims. Kaylee Lyons is here with more. Were the victims pleased at the amount, Kaylee?
Well, it's a lot higher than the amount PG&E initially offered. They originally said $8.4 billion, which was widely said that is not enough. Now they're coming back with $13.5 billion. So remains to be seen. This is still a plan that needs to be approved by Governor Gavin Newsom as well as the bankruptcy court. But it is a pretty solid plan, I would say, in terms of looking at it through the lens of PG&E's bankruptcy, because essentially paying out compensation to the victims of fire has been the biggest sticking point in PG&E's restructuring. Now, what this plan is actually going to look like is about half of equity in the restructured PG&E and then half cash, with about $5.5 billion paid up front and then the rest paid out over time. So it remains to be seen if this is what goes through, but it is a key step forward in those bankruptcy proceedings, and PG&E wants to exit bankruptcy by the middle of next year.
Well, Kaylee, I want to pick up on that point with regards to restructuring. Does this deal mean that PG&E's restructuring is now firmly back in its own hands?
Well, that's kind of an open question. Remember earlier this fall, PG&E lost exclusive right over its restructuring because the bankruptcy judge ruled that competing plans could come in, including one by bondholders like Elliott Management and PIMCO. And their plan also offered $13.5 billion. So PG&E now has essentially matched that, but it would essentially have wiped out equity value. I mean, there were analysts at the time saying that this stock could go to zero. Now, Citi is still warning that is a risk, but our analysts here at Bloomberg Intelligence, some others on the street, saying because PG&E's plan, the fact that they've settled with the wildfire victims, means that they would get paid out quicker. It's likely that it is the plan that is going to go through, but again, that still remains to be seen.
Just briefly, Kaylee, I mean, what does PG&E do in case of more wildfires? I mean, is its equipment ready for something like that?
Well, we saw earlier this fall the rolling blackouts that the company was putting in place to avoid this happening again. I mean, they record blackouts across the state of California, so they're having to take really dramatic steps to ensure that this doesn't happen again and they don't face another $30 billion in liabilities in the next year or the year after that.
Right, exactly. Well, Kaylee, thank you. That is our stock of the hour. Of course, the stock trading around $11.28. It had traded up as far as $70 way back there in 2017. Still ahead, we're going to talk Russia's Putin and Ukraine's Zelensky. They're talking peace in Paris. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Bonnie Quinn.
And in Washington, D.C., I'm Kevin Cirilli. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton. Mark?
Kevin, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky are meeting for the first time today at a summit in Paris. Both leaders are sitting down with French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, hoping to find a way to end the 5 years of fighting in eastern Ukraine. That conflict has killed 14,000 people. Ukrainian protesters are pressuring President Zelensky not to surrender too much to President Putin at their first face-to-face meeting. North Korea is taking a personal swipe at President Trump, saying his recent comments make him sound like a, quote, heedless and erratic old man. The statement by North Korean official Kim Jong-chol today comes ahead of Pyongyang's self-imposed year-end deadline for a breakthrough in nuclear talks. On Sunday, Mr. Trump tweeted that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was too smart and had too much to lose to renew hostilities with the United States. At least 5 people were killed when a volcano erupted on New Zealand's White Island today. Dozens more were injured. About 50 people were on the island at the time of the eruption. Many are believed to have been from a cruise ship. The New Zealand Defense Force says a Navy ship is on its way to offer support to the search and rescue effort. India is set to approve a law preventing Muslim migrants from neighboring countries from receiving citizenship. Prime Minister Narendra Modi says the changes are intended to protect religious minorities who are escaping persecution, not migrants from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. The controversial citizenship bill has sparked protests and fear around India and left millions at risk of being left stateless. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at Quick Take on Bloomberg by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Vonnie?
Mark, thank you. Paul Volcker has died. The former Federal Reserve chairman broke the back of runaway inflation in the 1980s and 3 decades later led President Barack Obama's bid to rein in proprietary risk-taking at commercial banks. It was codified as the Volcker Rule. Volcker passed away yesterday in New York at the age of 92. For more on his legacy, we're joined now by Michael McKee, Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent, who would have covered Volcker from a variety of angles for several decades. Michael, he was obviously the person who solved runaway inflation, but what did he do that was so different? What did he invent in terms of monetary policy?
Well, he changed the whole way the Federal Reserve went about carrying out monetary policy. Instead of targeting an interest rate, they targeted the level of the money supply, which created a whole new class of employees at Wall Street firms, and they were Fed watchers. They had to figure out on a week-to-week basis, as best they could, where they thought the Fed funds rate would be trading, just from watching the money supply as well. So that was a different way of doing it. It ended, of course, when Volcker left and they went back to the old system, but that was his contribution to the mechanics of monetary policy.
How was he so sure that it would work? Because indeed, it eventually worked and it got adopted, and this is what we think of now. Communication might be slightly different, but it's generally the Volcker principles that are adhered to. How did he know this?
He didn't know that it would work, and he had said that since, that he was doing what he thought he could do. His job was to attack inflation, which at one point went nearly to 15% on the CPI, and he was looking for something different that would increase confidence and be simple to explain, and would also impose some discipline on the policy process rather than just having people at the Fed guess at where the rate should be. But he didn't know it was going to work, and he says he certainly didn't know that the U.S. base rate would go to 20% at one point.
And Mike, his resurgence in the last decade in particular, he never really left, but his resurgence in terms of a force with regards to regulatory policy has really left its mark on the current economic and financial service regulatory structure of today. They still are every day talking about the Volcker Rule.
Well, Dodd-Frank is a very big, very broad set of laws and regulations that affect the financial industry, but only one of the regulations is named after a person, and that is Paul Volcker. His idea that the Wall Street trading on its own behalf was not good for the economy and for the financial system was codified into law. It's being modified now, but it will be forever known as the Volcker Rule. But you're right, Kevin, he did play a role for a very long time as sort of an eminence grise. And Barack Obama turned to him in 2009 when the economy was at its bottom and put him in charge of a committee of CEOs and business leaders to give a business perspective on what should be done for the economy. So he helped lead the reforms that were put into place and represented the administration up on Capitol Hill. But just the end of a long career that began in 1952 when he became an employee for the first time at the New York Fed.
And just even to follow up on that, I mean, in the current administration, at the beginning of the administration, there were some of those CEO type of forums, and one could argue that that was one of the legacies that Paul Volcker had, was uniting those CEO leaders. Do you think that legacy could return sometime in the next decade or so?
Well, you'd like to see it. It has to be done by someone outside of the Federal Reserve. Could be a retired Fed chairman, and we have a couple of those now. But at this point, it isn't clear what they contribute in terms of actual advice, whether they're united enough. We do have the Business Roundtable. Jamie Dimon from Wall Street chairs that. And they did change the way they look at business. It's no longer only to make a profit. It's to help employees as well. So maybe we are seeing a legacy effect that carries on.
And he was internationally recognized as somebody who could be extremely fair, extremely rigorous. So, for example, some of the other things that he accomplished in his life was overseeing the payment of claims by Swiss banks to Holocaust victims, for example. Also, the UN Oil for Food program, they were programs that he oversaw.
Well, it's an interesting transition that he made in the sense of he came into office known on the financial side, but not known to the rest of America, became very, very well known as interest rates went up and created a lot of enemies. People did not like what he did because mortgage rates went way up. A lot of businesses were hurt. And of course, we had a couple of recessions. But ever since then, as inflation and interest rates continued lower and lower and lower, his reputation was rehabilitated, and he was seen as somebody who did what he thought was the right thing instead of giving in to political expediency. And that burnished his reputation enough that people put him in charge of these other projects.
And as serious as he was also a very funny man. Michael, I imagine you have some anecdotes from your times covering him in Washington, D.C.
Well, you have to hope that you smoked cigars, because if you were going to be around Paul, you were going to get some cigar smoke.
All right. Michael McKee, thank you. Michael McKee, our international economics and policy correspondent. Paul Volcker, dead at the age of 92.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington.
And I'm Vonnie Quinn in New York. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky campaigned on bringing peace to Crimea. Today in Paris, he is getting his first shot at delivering on that promise. Zelensky is meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin for the first time in a so-called Normandy format, alongside French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. For more insight, joining us from Paris is Michael Bosserque, a global affairs analyst and former spokesman for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Michael, it's a phenomenal juxtaposition of pictures. On the one hand, you have closing arguments here in the impeachment inquiry. On the other, you have these leaders gathered in Paris. What would be the hope for this meeting? Do you have any hope?
Well, good to be with you, Vonnie. Of course, the hope is to bring peace finally to eastern Ukraine after 5 years of violence, which has cost up to 14,000 lives, billions of dollars of infrastructure damage, and millions displaced. Now, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, you're right, he campaigned on bringing peace to eastern Ukraine, as well as eradicating corruption. But he came here with a very low expectations, but also a very long shopping list. And above and beyond anything, he wants another prisoner swap, as well as return of control of the Ukraine-Russian border to Ukraine. And then after that, withdrawal of Russian-backed rebels, withdrawal of heavy weapons. But then on the other hand, you have Vladimir Putin, who woke up this morning probably not in a very good mood, because he received word that the World Anti-Doping Agency has banned Russian athletes from the Olympics and the World Cup. So we just saw the first images of the leaders, the four leaders meeting, and it was quite extraordinary to see Putin and Zelensky for the first time across from each other.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, these pictures are absolutely so dramatic. And to see Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel there as well, clearly there must be something behind the scenes that are giving hope to these leaders. I mean, they wouldn't meet in Normandy format in Paris, extend all of this hospitality if they didn't think something was going to come out of this, and that perhaps Europe would end up looking like the bigger between Europe and the US.
Yeah, well, the stakes are very high, obviously, and this is the first time that these talks are taking place, not only with Zelensky, but also with Zelensky really without his main benefactor, the United States, the White House. So a lot of people, including myself, have written that that has put him in a very weak position. But having said that, you also have Vladimir Putin, who is very well known for playing the long game. He can go home with any agreement or no agreement whatsoever and sell it to the Russian people as a win. But I am very worried, Vonnie, about Zelensky, because if he doesn't go home to Ukraine with some sort of win or victory, if he's seen as capitulating towards Russia, his political life could be very severely shortened. Already, there have been protests on the streets of Kiev warning him not to capitulate against Russia. So he's in a very, very difficult position.
Well, here in Washington, D.C., he's also at the eye of the political impeachment storm. And so I'm curious in terms of the international geopolitics of this, if Macron and Merkel are really going to be mediating anything, because Putin really would have his own agenda as it would relate to this very high-profile meeting, given the timing of such, with Zelensky.
Yeah, well, what a bizarre past few days, right? We had Rudy Giuliani going to Kyiv to continue to dig up dirt on, the Bidens, and also every 2 seconds saying that Ukraine is a corrupt place. Then fast forward a few days later, and you have these hearings going on today, split screen across the Atlantic in Washington, and then also these meetings here. So it's drawn a lot of attention away from these meetings, but at the same time, I guess if you can take anything out of these hearings is that the Ukrainian story has gone out, that, the conflict has gone on for so long, and maybe that kind of more informative public, if you will put pressure on these leaders to bring an end to this terrible conflict. Look, the thing with Macron and Merkel, it's probably their last kick of the can, if you will, on this issue. And I think they feel morally obligated to finally bring an end to this conflict and to put pressure on Putin to do so. But they at the same time, Macron needs to, there are strikes right now in Paris, as you know. He needs to pander to his public, maybe end the block on French dairy products to Russia. And then Merkel is hungry for Russian gas and doesn't want to pressure Putin too much either. So very complex situation.
And I can't let you go without asking you about the other development from Putin's perspective, which is the issue of the Olympics and the ban. And so this, on a day in which that news is breaking, Vladimir Putin now at the meeting with some of the top world leaders, how is that, if at all, going to cast a shadow on the meetings?
Right. Well, knowing what we know of Vladimir Putin, this strikes him at the heart more than anything else, more than sanctions, more than leaders shying away from him, like at the G7 or the G20. It's something that he can't go back to Russia and say, oh, this is nothing to the Russian public, because this is something that the Russian public, I think, will really react to, is that this is shameful that our Russian athletes have been put in this position. And I think, just quickly, I think it'll further work to isolate Russia, both in the mentality of the Russian people and also in terms of their leaders. So we'll see how that plays out. But it did not turn out to be a very good morning for Vladimir Putin today.
All right, global affairs analyst Michael Mossarchew, thank you very much for joining us from Paris. Coming up, President Trump may be getting renewed pressure over his business dealings. That's all next in our legal segment. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington.
And I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. The Judiciary Committee's latest impeachment hearing is underway. And Kevin, I've been trying to keep an eye on Live Go because it really is a phenomenal thing to watch the procedural, things that are going on in Washington, D.C. right now. It will be over, though, most likely by later on today, correct?
Yeah, and just in terms of going in terms of where this is all headed, midweek anticipating the drafts of those articles of impeachment with the vote still anticipated by the end of the calendar year. And then from there, there's going to be a back and forth with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. They are going to try to come up with rules. If Leader McConnell can't work with Democrats, it'll just be a party line vote, Vonnie. But that's the next legislative fight in terms of the process, and then a 6 to 8 week trial anticipated. And behind the scenes for the past at least week and a half, and I say emphasis on at least, Republicans at the various senatorial levels and the committee levels are already trying to, what they feel is, offer a defense for President Trump for that 6 to 8 week process.
Exactly, and we should know how President Trump feels about the whole thing because no doubt he will be tweeting about it. Now, he is facing impeachment on Capitol Hill, but he's fighting a number of other legal battles that extend way beyond Congress. Bloomberg's June Grasso and Greg Farrell join us now with more details. June.
Thanks, Vonnie. 3 subpoena cases are speeding their way to a possible showdown at the Supreme Court. And I say speeding in legal terms, not in regular people's terms. So, Greg, 3 appellate courts ruled against President Trump on these subpoenas. There were different subpoenas, but the reasoning was basically the same. Tell us about that.
Yes, exactly. One comes from a House committee wanting to see, Trump's business records going back several years in his tax returns. Another comes from the district attorney in Manhattan, Cy Vance, who's pursuing a, potential criminal case into, that involves payments from the Trump organization. So there have been different, as you say, different nuances in the appeals court's rulings in favor of the people who want the returns, and basically discarding the president's arguments that he's either above the law or this would constitute some kind of an inhibition on his being able to carry out the duties of being president. But consistent with the president's, and as a real estate mogul, Donald Trump's long-standing behavior and responses to other challenges throughout his career. He's very litigious, and I think just the fact that he's been able to push this off and extend by weeks and then months and possibly well into next year any final resolution through the Supreme Court has been, to some extent, a victory in the short term for him now.
Right. I actually made a graph to try to keep track of where these 3 cases are, because one is already at the Supreme Court. The justices are going to be talking about that on Friday. One, he's already appealed to the Supreme Court, filed the papers, and the other one, he hasn't filed the papers yet. So when the justices talk on Friday, it's about Cy Vance's subpoena. How likely are they to take the case?
I think there'll be some internal pressure to take it just to resolve this matter, because it's a matter that goes beyond just this particular president, and will extend, well into the future. Because of the way things work, the legal machinations against the president this time are bound to be repeated when the other party takes power next time. This is just going to set a precedent. So I think there'll be some interest by the Supreme Court to actually resolve or lay down a marker on this. I don't know that. I'm just guessing.
I know, and I think you're right there. Now, President Trump's attorneys keep saying this is a case of first, and it is a case of first, but there were the cases before the Supreme Court involving Presidents Nixon and Clinton. So even though they're not directly on point, do they give a little bit of guidance to the court or some kind of precedence?
Yes, I would think so, especially in the case of Nixon, where one of the reasons Nixon resigned was after there was a Supreme Court ruling that he would have to turn over the recordings he had made in his own office. And I think he knew that was game over for him, and that led to his resignation. So it was a Supreme Court decision basically, allowing the House Investigative Committee to, get evidence that could be used against him.
And so we will find out on Friday whether or not they're going to take, perhaps on Friday, you're right.
Right, they'll have the arguments, and I think, it'll be expedited no matter what. So possibly by Christmas, they'll actually decide whether or not they're going to take this.
This is breakneck speed for the Supreme Court, though. I mean, to have gotten these cases up, these cases were decided in November and December.
Yes. So the reason it's so quickly, I think, is because they realized a lot is at stake here. It does affect not just the impeachment, but also the election next year. So rather than drag this out so that it comes out next October 1st, a month before the election, I think it's in everybody's interest, including the Supreme Court, to get this resolved and clearly as well before the election next year as possible.
And we should mention that these have nothing to do with the impeachment. These subpoenas were before
Correct.
The impeachment. So now, in addition to all these disputes over his financial records, which he's trying to keep secret, there are 2 appeals courts that this week, one in D.C. and one in Virginia, are going to decide whether or not, or at least hear oral arguments to decide whether or not these emoluments lawsuits should go forward. So explain the emoluments cases, because
yes,
they're
of course.
tricky.
Yes, briefly, 2 district attorneys in Maryland and Washington, D.C. have filed a suit against the president, against the Trump organization, basically the president accusing him of violating the emoluments clause in the Constitution, which forbids someone using their office as a way to make money. And although the fact that Trump is president, the fact that he owns this high-quality hotel in downtown Washington has turned that into a magnet for businesses coming from all over the world. And the lawsuits basically claim that he's taking money away from other hotels and restaurants that would be doing this business. And the argument is over whether or not this really is an emolument or whether or not it's just something, the president's a businessman and he can't stop doing business.
All right. Well, we will find out more about those this week. Thanks so much. Back to you, Vonnie.
June Grasso, thank you for that. That's Bloomberg's June Grasso there, and of course, Greg Farrell. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. We're also watching markets. As you see, we're having just a little bit of a drop for the S&P 500. They're down about 0.2% right now. Still, though, several stocks higher. Freeport-McMoRan and some of the retailers up more than 3% apiece. And we have some Apple suppliers up 2.5%, Qorvo and Skyworks as well. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.